І зараз я передаю слово нашому міцному партнеру і колезі, який бував у Полтаві, і з яким ми провели вже не одну конференцію. Це наш добрий друг, доктор філології і представник Slavic-Eurasian Research Center Hokkaido University Daisuke Adachi. Будь ласка, Daisuke-сан, просимо вас до слова.
Thank you for introducing me. Please share my slide. So please let me begin my presentation entitled The Problem of Reproduction in Gogol's Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka. Today, I will talk about theoretical and historical reconsideration of the relationship between Gogol and photography. First, I will introduce the historical background of this problem. In the first part, I will reconceptualize early photography as trace. Next, we will see that early photography undermined the concept of trace peculiar to the early German Romantics, turning hieroglyphics into pure pictures. The third part analyzes Gogol's poetics that imitates and radicalizes the photographic picturization and finds its origin in the first collection of his tales, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka. As a conclusion, I will suggest that Gogol's parody of the photographic image can be considered as a historical and cultural response of old writing media to new optical media. First, introduction, Gogol and photography. On January 7, 1839, Louis-François d'Arago, a noted scientist and Republican deputy of France, introduced Louis Daguerre's new invention at the French Academy of Sciences. On August 19, Daguerre's process was introduced to the public. This early form of photography, called daguerreotype, quickly spread to the world, including Russia. Accordingly, the invention of photography preceded the publication of the Overcoat and the first part of Dead Souls in 1842. That is, it coincided with Nikolai Gogol's writing activities. Nevertheless, apart from the occasional mentions by Gogol's contemporaries and later scholars, the relationship between Gogol's writing and photography has not been studied systematically and in detail until present day. It must be admitted that Gogol did not depict photograph in his tales and even rarely mentioned photography. At least once. We will come back to this case later. However, the technical conditions under which early photography created images, as well as the contemporary discourse about those conditions, were deeply related to Gogol's literary practice. In this paper, I would like to show that Gogol's writing can be reinterpreted as critical analysis of the photographic image by using the photographic image, that is, as self-reflection of photography. After its emergence, the term daguerreotypical soon came to be used in Russian literature of the period, arousing negative reactions from literary critics. Early photography was accused of its dryness, as a Soviet scholar has pointed out. Quote, it was at that time still only able to mechanically copy nature, and in its pursuit of outer resemblance, it often bypassed the inner side of human being or a natural phenomena. End quote. Also, at that time, Gogol's style of description was popularly associated with daguerreotype, Belinsky and Markov, two major critics of the day, had a high opinion of him, finding in his works the invisible or inner value that they couldn't detect in early photography. However, I'd like to suggest two modifications and clarifications to the aforementioned discourse on the relationship between Gogol and early photography. First, the cultural connotations and context of mechanical copy are not sufficiently clear to us. Second, Belinsky and Markov are correct in pointing out that Gogol is ideologically critical of mechanical reproduction. However, they miss the fact that Gogol criticizes mechanical reproduction by using it as a tool of parody. Rather, as we will see later, mechanical self-reproduction is technically the core of Gogol's poetics. We will clarify what was perceived as mechanical reproduction in the discourse on early photography. First, it should be noted that both before and after Daguerre's invention of photography, one of the greatest technical difficulty it was confronted with was the fixation of image, that is, the preservation of trace. The situation is well illustrated by the titles of the articles published in Russia that reported the news of the invention. In the early stages of photography, its materials required substantial exposure time to register sharp image. Louis Daguerre himself acknowledged it. The extended exposure time needed to create a successful photograph hindered daguerreotype from producing a clear record of motion. This limitation was keenly grasped by contemporary journalists. As these passages show, please see the slide. You can see the uncanny image of daguerreotype portrait and citations from contemporary discourse on daguerreotype. As these passages show, for technical reasons, early photography had a certain limitation. Namely, it could only represent motionless objects, still life. Consequently, the human body was divided into two parts. That is, the representable parts that remain motionless, deprived of time and activity in return for being recognizably recorded on daguerreotype. And the unrepresentable parts that move too fast to be fixed as image. Thus, the image of life was created by acting motionless, as in tableau vivant, a stage picture played by living but motionless people, famously found in the last scene of Gogol's The Government Inspector. Hence, the lasting effect, immortality of early photography, where, as Walter Benjamin has pointed out, quote, the models presented an extreme opposite to the figure in a snapshot. Quote, everything in the early pictures was designed to last, end quote. Representing lively performance of being dead, early photography transformed the human body into trace, ambivalent space between life and death, between human being and thing. Understanding early photography as trace leads to its comparison with the romantic representation of trace, which was a philosophical foundation of romantic literature around the beginning of the 19th century. As is well known, the early German romantics, represented by Friedrich Schlegel and Novalis, considered letters as a medium for a previously unknown operation to rediscover the lost and forgotten fundamental meaning of the world. In this worldview, Egyptian hieroglyphics had a privileged symbolic meaning until they were deciphered by Champollion in 1822. Novalis, for example, deplored the loss of hieroglyphic meaning in modern times, which, however, prompted the infinite spiraling movement of the Romantics toward the absolute. See his famous fragment, quote, Formerly, all things were spirit appearances. Now we can see nothing but dead repetition, which we do not understand. The meaning of the hieroglyph is missing. We are still living on the fruits of better times. End quote. Following sample on the slide, you can see the conflict between letters and pictures from a distance. They may look like textiles, but when you see closer, you can see that they are letters. This is how to say daguerreotyped copy of the Rosetta Stone where letters were inscribed. From far, you can see only the image. But if you see more closely, you can read letters. So in this picture image, you can find the ambivalence between image and letter. Following Champollion's decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, however, the emergence of daguerreotype finally undermined the Romantic concept of the hieroglyph. In 1839, Arago explained to the French Chamber of Deputies the bill for rewarding the inventions of the daguerreotype as follows. Friedrich Schlegel had already yes, you can see the bill that Arago submitted to the French Chamber of Deputies. Friedrich Schlegel had already described the hieroglyph using three predicates: pictographic writing, Bilderschrift, natural script, Naturschrift, and reader language, Praxis. Inheriting and developing his idea, Arago presented an innovative understanding of the hieroglyph as a picture, regardless of its meaning, which was made possible by daguerreotype copying. Photographic reproduction transformed letters into pure pictures, depriving the former of their meaning. So hieroglyph is itself, of course, a letter, but if you copy hieroglyph, the letter is transformed into a pure picture. So such ambivalence between a picture and a letter was invented or produced by a daguerreotype, that is photography. So finally, we reached Gogol's poetics. Gogol shared a romantic view on trace and hieroglyph, understanding letters as a medium for endless self-reflection directed towards the absolute meaning. His experiment in this context consisted of maximizing the contrast between meaning and picture in letters. First, we will examine several examples of how letters are copied as pure pictures, being deprived of meaning. See two examples for the tale of how Ivan Ivanich quarreled with Ivan Nikiforovich. Quote, Ivan Ivanich has big, expressive, snuff-colored eyes and a mouth like the letter Ijitsa. Ivan Nikiforovich has little yellowish eyes, completely lost between his thick eyebrows and chubby cheeks, and a nose that looks like a ripe plum. Second example, Ivan Ivanich could no longer control himself. His lips were quivering. His mouth lost its usual resemblance to the letter Ijitsa. This is also ambivalence between letter and picture, and was transformed into an O. This is also such a ambivalence. His eyes blinked until it was positively alarming. This was extremely rare with Ivan Ivanich. He had to be greatly exasperated to be brought to this pass. End quote. Third example is from Dead Souls. At every few steps, mincing along rather deftly and turning right and left, that is Chichkov, suddenly throw in a punctuating scrape of his small foot, or something like a comma. It is necessary to make special mention of Petersburg tales in which bureaucrats copy letters with no regard to their meaning, and painters paint pictures without paying attention to their hidden content. In the overcoat, Akakievich is absorbed in nothing but copying documents. As narrator depicts him, quote, no, he loved his work. In that copying, he found an interesting and pleasant world of his own, end quote. Even his subjectivity is expressed only by a discrete hieroglyphs on his face. Quote, there was a look of enjoyment on his face. Certain letters were favorites with him, and when he came to them, he was delighted. He chuckled to himself and winked and moved his lips, so that it seemed as though every letter his pen was forming could be read in his face. End quote. The king of these writing machines, Populishin, the diary of a madman, writes his diary in automatic writing, which may prefigure the later avant-garde experiments. The date of the last entry in his diary is as follows. You see on the slide. I cannot read these picture letters. Next slide. The virtual resurrection of Dead Souls in which Chichkov presents their names listed, pure letters, living human beings, is also based on the mechanical reproduction of letters. The hero collects, that Chichkov collects lists of dead serfs from landowners for the hidden purpose of mortgaging them to the government. The names of the dead souls are exchangeable for money because both are signs without substance. The story contains a symbolic scene in which, when Chichkov glances at the names of the serfs, he involuntarily starts telling their fictitious biographies, as if recovering each serf's lost life. As far as I know, Gogol once mentioned early photography in a letter to Annenkov dated on August 12th, 1847, referring to the Paris letters recently published by his friend. Gogol compares his description of Paris with daguerreotype. Quote, there's a lot of observation and exactness, but exactness daguerreotypical, end quote. This comment may seem to be merely repeating the general view of contemporary critics that I have introduced in this paper, However, the following passage reveals where Gogol's interests lay. Quote, the hand which wrote them, that is letters, cannot be felt. The author himself, wax, which has not received a form, although wax of the first quality, transparent, clean, just as needed for to cast a figure from it. End quote. In Gogol's poetics, the hand is a medium of creation, but also a medium of repetition and reproduction. According to Gogol, as post-romantic writer, this ambivalence is intrinsic to human beings who can only imitate the creator's act of creation. One of the most essential long-term tasks Gogol tackled was to explore the boundaries between creation and reproduction by examining possible variants of repetition. To this end, he proliferated and multiplied repetition in his texts, which were filled with motifs such as mirror and double. Next slide. As is well known, the first collection of his tales, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, 1831-1832, is filled with the comedy of errors, which give us the first examples of reproduction that does not produce the sameness. In the Lost Letter, a document from the Cossack Grand Duke to the Emperor Ekaterina is taken away by the devil. The narrator, Homer's grandfather, who serves as messenger, is forced to play a card game called Idiot with a fish to get the document back. Although the hut with the lost document returns safely, the young horse that was kidnapped also by the devil returns as bones. When he, that is the grandfather of Homer, when he returns back to home, the children point to his wife and say, Дивиш, мати, мов дурна, скаче. The wife, in a state of sleepwalking, is dancing around like a fool, as if repeating the memory of his play with the witch. Nothing is repeated as the same one, except lifeless things as document, letter, or hut. The origin of the analogy between the reproduction by human hand and the reproduction by nature can be found in Ivan Fyodorovich Shponika and his aunt, published in the second volume of Evenings on a Farm from near Dikanka. Contrasting the aunt's manly, charitable, menacing hand that could turn a drunken miller, worthless fellow, into a treasure. With a dark brown gown with little flounces and a red cashmere shawl she wears, the narrator pronounces, quote, "It seems as though nature had made an unpardonable mistake," end quote. Meanwhile, in its early stages, photography was compared to nature's spontaneous reproduction that no longer required artist's hand, as Jeffrey E. Batchen has investigated in his excellent study. The discourse is clearly seen in the title of the paper written by Henry E. Talbot. Please see the slide. You can see the title of Talbot paper, and this is entitled "Some Account of the Art of Photogenic Drawing, or the Process by which Natural Objects may be made to delineate themselves without the aid of the artist's pencil." But Gogol problematizes this unnatural reproduction. And we have found the origin of his such poetics in Dikanka collection. Conclusion. Given the contemporary discourse on the absence of the hand in photography, it is clear that Gogol used the writing hand as an allegory of the mediality, technical in-betweenness that needs to be scrutinized, observed. Examining the pictorial reproduction of letters, he called into question the identical iteration as a result of nature's spontaneous reproduction. Gogol's writing both parodied and created the situation of media and culture of his time, where letters were replicated as pictures, regardless of their meaning. Imitating the self-reflection exercised by the new optical media, the old writing media presented the work of art as the dawn of the age of mechanical reproduction. You can see the photo of Gogol, which I think only one example that remains. Only one example of photography of Gogol. I think this is only one. He left only this photographic image, as far as I know. So this is all. Thank you for listening. Jack.
Dear Daisuke-san, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you for our mutual cooperation, and we hope that our cooperation will be continuing. Thank you.